Hi guys, welcome back for chapter 2 of the Wendigo by his name always escapes me. I gotta scroll back up. Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 2. Oh, and before I forget, I forgot to do a warning at my previous video. Some of the books I'm going to be reading are old-timey books. So there's going to be some like swearing or like racism things that they didn't really consider a problem back then, but kind of make us uncomfortable. Since this is a horror book, or supposed to be from what I understand, the goal of this book is to make us really uncomfortable. So this isn't for everyone. I plan to do other types of books too. But again, this book's goal is to make us uncomfy. Alright, so with that out of the way, chapter 2. In the morning, the camp was astir before the sun. There had been a light fall of snow during the night, and the air was sharp. Punk had done his duty betimes, for the odor of coffees and fried bacon reached every tent. All were in good spirits. "Wind shifted," cried Hank vigorously, watching Simpson and his guide already loading the small canoe. "It's across the lake. Dead right for you fellers. And the snow will make bully trails. If there's any moose mussing around up there, they'll not get so much as a tail instant of you. With the wind as it is, good luck, Monsieur Défago. Whoops." He added vociferously, giving the name its French pronunciations for once. "Bonny chance." Défago returned the good wishes apparently in the best of spirits. The silent mood gone, before 8 o'clock old Punk had the camp to himself. Cathcart and Hank were far along the trail that led westwards, while the canoe that carried Défago and Simpson, with the silk tent and grub for 2 days, was already a dark speck bobbing on the bosom of the lake, going due east. The wintry sharpness of the air was tempered now by a sun that dropped the wooded ridges and blazed with a luxurious warmth upon the world of lake and forest below. The loons flew skimming through sparkling spray that the wind lifted. Divers shook their dripping heads to the sun and popped smartly out of sight again. And as far as the eye could reach rose the leagues of endless crowding bush, desolate in its lonely sweep and grandeur, untrodden by the foot of man, and stretched its mighty and unbroken carpet right up to the frozen shores of Hudson Bay. Simpson, who saw it all for the first time as he paddled hard in the bow of the dancing canoe, was enchanted by its azure beauty. His heart drank in the sense of freedom in great spaces, just as his lungs drank in the cool and perfumed wind. Behind him in the stern sat singing fragments of his native chanties, Défago steering the craft of birch bark like a thing of life, answering cheerfully all his companions' questions. Both were gay and light-hearted. On such occasions men lose the superficial, worldly distractions. They became human beings working together for a common end. Simpson, the employer, and Défago, the employed, among these primitive forces were simply 2 men, the guider and the guided, to superior superior knowledge, of course, assumed control, and the younger man fell without a second thought into a quasi subordinate position. He never dreamed of objecting when Défago dropped the Mister and addressed him as, say, Simpson or Simpson, boss, which was invariably the case before they reached the further shore after a stiff paddle of 12 miles against a headwind. He only laughed and liked it, and then ceased to notice it at all. For this divinity student was a young man of parts and character, though as yet, of course, untravelled. And on this trip, the first time he had seen any country but his own, and a little Switzerland, the huge scale of things somewhat bewildered him. It was one thing, he realized, to hear about primitive forests, but quite another to see them, while to dwell in them and to seek acquaintance with their wild life was, again, an intimidation that no intelligent man could undergo without a certain shifting of personal values hitherto held for permanent and sacred. Simpson knew the first faint intention of this emotion when he held the new .303 or 3.303 rifle in his hands and looked along its pair of faultless, gleaming barrels the 3 days' journey to their headquarters by lake and partage had carried the process of a stage further, and now that he was about to plunge beyond even the fringe of wilderness where they were camped into the virgin heart of uninhabited regions, as vast as Europe itself, the true nature of the situation stole upon him with the effect of delight and awe that his imagination was fully capable of appreciating. It was himself and Défago against the multitude, at least against a Titan. The bleak splendors of these remote and lonely forests rather overwhelmed him with a sense of his own littleness. A stern quality of the tangled backwoods, which can only be described as merciless and terrible, rose out of these far blue woods swimming upon the horizon, and revealed itself. He understood the silent warning. He realized his own utter helplessness. Only Défago, as a symbol of distant civilization, where man was master, stood between him and a pitiless death by exhaustion and starvation. It was thrilling to him, therefore, to watch Défago turn over the canoe upon the shore, pack the paddles carefully underneath, and then proceed to blaze the spruce stems for some distance on either side of an almost invisible trail. With the careless remark thrown in, "Say, Simpson, if anything happens to me, you'll find the canoe all correct by these marks, and strike due west in the sun to hit the home camp again, see?" It was the most natural thing in the world to say, and he said it without any noticeable inflection of the voice. Only it happened to express the youth's emotion at the time was an utterance that the symbolic of the situation and his own helplessness as a factor in it. He was alone with Défago in a primitive world. That was all. The canoe, another symbol of man's as this tea was now to be left behind. The small yellow patches made on the tree by the axe was the only indications of its hiding place. Meanwhile, shouldering the packs between them, each man carrying his own rifle, they followed the slender trail over the rocks and fallen trunks and across half-frozen swamps, skirting numerous lakes that fairly gleamed the forest. The borders fringed with mist, towards 5 o'clock, found themselves suddenly on the edge of the woods, looking out across a large sheet of water in front of them, dotted with pine-clad islands of all describable shapes and sizes. 50 island water, announced Défago wearily, and the sun just going down to dip his bald old head into it, he added, with unconscious poetry, and immediately they set about pitching camp for the night. In a few minutes, under the skillful hands that never made a movement too much or a movement too little, the silk tents stood taut and cozy, the beds of balsam brats ready laid, and a brisk cooking fire burnt with the minimum of smoke, while the young Scotchmen cleaned the fish that they had caught trolling behind the canoe. Défago guessed he would just as soon take a turn through the bush for indications of moose may come across a trunk where they bend and rubbed horns, he said as he moved off, or feeding on the last of the maple leaves, and he was gone. His small figure melted away like a shadow in the dusk, while Simpson noted with a kind of admiration how easily the force absorbed him into herself. A few steps, and it seemed, and he was no longer visible. Yet there was little underbrush thereabout. The trees stood somewhat apart, well spaced, and in the clearings grew silver birch and maple, spear-like and slender, against the immersed stems of spruce and hemlock. But for the occasional prostrate monsters and the boulders of grey rock that thrust unclothed shoulders here and there out to the ground, and might as well have been a bit of a park in the old country. Almost one might have seen in it the hand of man. A little to the right, however, began the great burnt section, miles in extent, proclaiming its real character, brûlé as it is called, where the fires of the previous year had raged for weeks, and the blackened stumps now rose gaunt and ugly, barefoot branches like gigantic match-heads stuck into the ground, savage and desolate beyond words. The perfume of charcoal and rain-soaked ashes still hung faintly about it. The dusk rapidly darkened. The glades grew dark, the crackling of fire and the wash of little waves along the rocky lake shore, were the only sound audible. The wind had dropped with the sun, and all in that vast world of branches, nothing stirred. Any moment, it seemed, the woodland gods, who were to be worshipped in silence and loneliness, might stretch their mighty and terrific outlines among the trees. In front, through doorways pillared by huge straight stems, lay the stretch of the 50 islands water, a crescent-shaped lake, some 15 miles from tip to tip, and perhaps 5 miles across where they were camped. A sky of rose and saffron, more clear than any atmosphere Simpson had ever known, still dropped its pale, steaming fires across the waves, where the islands, 100 surely rather than 50, floated like fairy bouquets of some enchanted fleet, barges of some enchanted fleet, fringed with pines whose crescent fingered most delicately the sky. They almost seemed to move upwards as the light faded, about to weigh anchor and navigate the pathways of the heavens instead of the currents of their native and desolate lake. The strips of colored clouds, like flaunting pennies, signaled their departure to the stars. The beauty of the scene was strangely uplifting. Simpson smoked the fish and burnt his fingers into the bargain in his efforts to enjoy it, and at the same time tinned the frying pans in the fire. Yet at the back of his thoughts lay another aspect of the wilderness, the indifference to human life, the merciless spirit of desolation which took no note of man, the sense of his utter loneliness now that even Défago had gone, came close as he looked about him and listened to the sound of his companion's returning footsteps. There was a pleasure in the sensation, yet with it a perfectly comprehensible alarm, and instantly the thought stirred in him, what should I do, could I do, if anything happened and he did not come back? They enjoyed the well-earned supper, eating untold quantities of fish, and drinking unmilked tea strong enough to kill men who had not covered 30 miles of hard going, eating little on the way. And when it was over, they smoked and told stories around the blazing fire, laughing, stretching weary limbs and discussing plans for the morrow. Défago was in excellent spirits, though disappointed at having no signs of moose to report. But it was dark, and he had not gone far. The brulee, too, was bad. His clothes and hands were smeared with charcoal. Simpson, watching him, realized with new vividness their position alone together in the wilderness. Défago, he said presently, these woods, you know, are a bit too big to feel quite at home in, to feel comfortable in, I mean. Eh? He merely gave an expression to the mood of the moment, which he hardly prepared for the earnestness and solemnity even with which the guide took him up. You hit it right, Simpson, boss, he replied, fixing his searching brown eyes on his face. And that's the truth, sure. There is no end to them, no end at all. And he added in a lower tone, as if to himself, there's lots found out that, and gone plummet to pieces. But the man's gravity of the matter was not quite to the other's liking. It was a little too suggestive for the scenery and setting. He was sorry he had broached the subject. He remembered suddenly how his uncle had told him that men were sometimes stricken with a strange fever of the wilderness, and that the seduction of the uninhabited waste caught them so fiercely that they went forth, half fascinated, half deluded, to their death. And he had the shrewd idea that his companion held something in that sympathy with that queer type. He led the conversation on to other topics, on to Hank and the doctor, for instance, and the natural rivalry as to who should get the first sight of moose. Give me a moment. Accidentally scrolled down too far. Here we go. If they went due west, observed Défago carelessly, there's 60 miles between us now, with old Punk at halfway house eating himself full to busting with fish and coffee. They laughed together over the picture, but the casual mention of those 60 miles again made Simpson realize the prodigious scale of this land where they hunted. 60 miles was a mere step, 200 miles more than a step. Stories of lost hunters rose persistently before his memory. The passion and mystery of the homeless and wandering men, seduced by the beauty of great forests, swept his soul in a way too vivid to be quite pleasant. He wondered vaguely whether it was the mood of his companion that invited this unwelcome suggestion with such persistence. "Sing us a song, Défago, if you're not too tired," he asked. "One of those old warrior songs you sang the other night." He handed his tobacco pouch to the guide and filled his own pipe, while the Canadian, nothing loth, sent his light across the lake in one of those plaintive, almost melancholy chanties with which lumbermen and tappers lessen the burden of their lumber. There was an appealing and romantic flavor about it, something that recalled the atmosphere of the old pioneer days, which Indians of the wilderness were leagued together, battles frequent in the old country farther off than it is today. The sound traveled pleasantly over the water, but the forest at their backs seemed to swallow it down. The sound pleasantly traveled over the water, but the forest at their backs seemed to swallow it down with a single gulp that permitted neither echo nor resonance. It was the middle of the third verse that Simpson noticed something unusual, something that brought his thoughts back with a rush from faraway scenes. A curious change had come into the man's voice. Even before he knew what it was, uneasiness caught him, and looking up quickly, he saw Défago, though still singing, was peering about him into the bush, as though he had heard or saw something. His voice grew fainter, dropped to a hush, then ceased altogether. The same instant, with movement amazingly alert, he started to his feet and stood upright, sniffing the air. Like a dog scenting game, he drew the air into his nostrils in short, sharp breaths, turning quickly as he did so, in all directions, and finally pointing down the lake shore eastwards. It was a performance unpleasantly suggestive, and at the same time singularly dramatic. Simpson's heart fluttered disagreeably as he watched it. "Lord, man, how'd you made me jump!" he exclaimed on his feet beside him in the same instant, and peering over his shoulder into the sea of darkness. "What's up? Are you frightened?" Even before the question was out of his mouth, he knew it was foolish, for any man with a pair of eyes in the back of his head could see that the Canadian had turned white down to his very gills. Not even the sunburnt and the glare of fire could hide that. The student felt himself tremble a little, weakish in the knees. "What's up?" he repeated quickly. "Did you smell moose? Or anything queer? Anything wrong?" He lowered his voice instinctively. The forest pressed around them with its encircling wall. The nearer tree stems gleam like a bronze in the firelight. Beyond that, darkness, and, so far as he could tell, a silence of death. Just behind them, a passing puff of wind that lifted a single leaf, looked at it, then laid it softly down again without disturbing the rest of the canopy. It seemed as if a million invisible cases had combined just to produce a single visible effect. Other life pulsed about them and was gone. Défago turned abruptly. The livid hue of his face had turned to a dirty gray. "I never said I heard or smelt nothin'," he said slowly and emphatically, in an odd, altered voice that conveyed somehow a touch of defiance. "I was only taking a look around, so to speak. It's always a mistake to get too previous with your questions." Then he added suddenly, with obvious effect in his more natural tone, "Have you got the matches, Boss Simpson?" and produced to light the pipe he had half filled just before he began to sing. Without speaking another word, they sat down again by the fire, Défago changing his side so that he could face the direction the wind came from. For even a tenderfoot that could tell that Défago changed his position in order to hear and smell all there was to be heard and smelt. And since now he faced the lake with his back to the trees, it was evident nothing in the forest that had sent so strange a sudden a warning to his marvelously trained nerves. "Guess now I don't feel like singing any," he explained presently, of his own accord. "That song kinder brings back memories that troublesome to me. I never ought to have begun it. It sets me on to imagining things, see?" Clearly the man was still frightened with some profoundly moving emotion. He wished to excuse himself in the eyes of the other, but the explanation, and that it was only a part of the truth, was a lie. He knew perfectly well that Simpson was not deceived by it, for nothing could explain the livid terror that had dropped over his face while he stood there sniffing the air, and nothing, no amount of blazing fire or chatting on ordinary subjects, could make the camp exactly as it had been before. The shadow of an unknown horror, naked if unguessed, that had flushed for an instant in the face and gestures of the guide, had also communicated itself vaguely and therefore more potently to his companion. The guide's visible efforts to dismember the truth only made things worse. Moreover, to add to the younger man's uneasiness, was the difficulty, nay, the impossibility, he felt of asking questions, and also his complete ignorance as to the cause. Indians, wild animals, forest fires, all these he knew were wholly out of the question. His imagination searched vigorously, but in vain. Yet, somehow or other, after a long spell of smoking, talking, and roasting themselves before the great fire, the shadow that had so suddenly invaded their peaceful camp began to shift. Perhaps Défago's efforts, or the return of his quiet and normal attitude, accomplished this. Perhaps Simpson himself had exaggerated the affair out of all the proportion to the truth. or possibly, the vigorous air of the wilderness brought its own powers of healing. Whatever the cause, the feeling of immediate horror seemed to have passed away as mysteriously as it had come, for nothing occurred to feed it. Simpson began to feel he had permitted himself the unreasoning terror of a child. He put it down partly to a certain subconscious excitement that this wild and immense scenery generated in his blood, partly to the spell of solitude and partly to over-fatigue. That pallor in the guide's face was, of course, uncommonly hard to explain, yet it might have been due, in some ways, to an effect of firelight or his own imagination. He gave it the benefit of the doubt. He was Scotch. When a somewhat unordinary emotion had disappeared, the mind always finds a dozen ways of explaining away the causes. Simpson lit a last pipe and tried to laugh to himself. On getting home to Scotland, it would make quite a good story. He did not realize that this laughter was a sign that the terror still lurked in the recesses of his soul, that in fact it was merely one of the controversial signs by which a man, seriously alarmed, tries to persuade himself that he is not so. Défago, however, heard that low laughter and looked up with surprise on his face. The two men stood side by side, kicking the embers about before going to bed. It was 10 o'clock, a late hour for hunters to still be awake. "What's tickling you?" he asked in his ordinary tone, yet gravely. I was thinking of our little toy woods at home, just at the moment," stammered Simpson, coming back to what really dominated his mind, and startled by the question, "and comparing them to all this." And he began to sweep his arm around to indicate to the bush. A pause followed in which neither of them said anything. "All the same, I wouldn't laugh about it if I was you," Défago added, looking over Simpson's shoulder into the shadows. "There's places in there that nobody wouldn't never see into. Nobody knows what lives in there, either. Too big, too far off." The suggestion in the guide's manner was immense and horrible. Défago nodded. The expression on his face was dark. He, too, felt uneasy. The younger man understood that in a hinterland of this size there might as well be depths of the woods that would never be in the life of the world be known or trodden. The thought was not exactly the sort he welcomed. In a loud voice, cheerfully, he suggested that it was time for bed, but the guide lingered, tinkering with the fire, arranging the stones needlessly, doing a dozen things that did not really need doing. Evidently there was something he wanted to say, yet he found difficult to get at. "Say you, Boss Simpson," he began suddenly, as the late shower of sparks went up into the air. "Don't you didn't smell nothing, do you? Nothing particular, I mean." The commonplace question, Simpson realized, veiled a dreadly serious thought in his mind. A shiver ran down his back. "Nothing but burnt wood," he replied firmly, kicking again at the embers. The sound of his own foot made him start. "And all the evening you ain't smelt nothing," persisted the guide, peering at him through the gloom. "Nothing extraordinary, indifferent to anything else you smelt before?" "No, no, man, nothing at all," he replied aggressively, half angrily. Défago's face cleared. "That's good," he exclaimed with evident relief. "That's good to hear you. Good to hear." "Have you?" asked Simpson sharply. The same instinct regretted the question. The Canadian came closer in the darkness. He shook his head. "I guess not," he said, though without overwhelming conviction. "It must have just been that song of mine that did it. It was the song they sing in the lumber camps and the God-forsaken places like that, when they skeered the Wendigos somewhere around, doing a bit of traveling." "And what's the Wendigo, pray?" he asked quickly, irritated because again he could not have prevented that sudden shiver of the nerves. He knew he was close upon the man's terror and the cause of it, yet a passionate curiosity a rush of passionate curiosity overcame his better judgment and his fear. Défago turned swiftly and looked at him as though he were suddenly about to shriek. Eyes shone and his mouth was wide open. Yet all he said, or whispered rather, was his voice sank very low, was "It nothing but those lousy fellers believe when they've been hitting the bottle too long. That sort of great animal that lives up yonder." He jerked his hand northwards, quick as lightning in its tracks and bigger than anything else in the bush. "Ain't supposed to be very good to look at, that's all." "A backward superstition," began Simpson, moving hastily towards the tent in order to shake the hand of the guide. Shake off the hand of the guide that clutched his arm. Come, hurry up for God's sake, and get the lantern going. It's time we were in bed and asleep if we're going to be up with the sun tomorrow." The guide was close on his heels. "I'm coming," he answered. "Out to the darkness, I'm coming." And after a slight delay he appeared with the lantern, and hanging it from a nail in the front pole of the tent. The shadows of the 100 trees shifted their place quickly as he did so, and when he stumbled over the rope, diving swiftly inside, the whole tent trembled as though a gust of wind struck it. The two men lay down, without undressing, upon their beds of soft balsam boughs, cunningly arranged. Inside, all was warm and cozy, but outside the world of the crowding trees pressed close about them, marshalling their millions of shadows, and smothering the little tent that stood there, like a wee white shell facing the ocean of tremendous forest. Between the two lonely figures within, however, there pressed another shadow that was not a shadow of the night. It was a shadow cast by the strange fear, never wholly exorcised, that had leapt suddenly upon Défago in the middle of his singing, and Simpson, as he laid there, watched the darkness through the open flap of the tent, ready to plunge into the fragrant abyss of sleep. Knew the first that the unique and profound stillness of the primeval forest, when no one stirs, and when the night has weighed in the substance that enters into the soul to bind a veil about it, then sleep took him. Alright, that is the end of chapter 2. Thank you guys for listening. I hope to see you guys next time. Bye bye.